It is to be made of the finest flour mixed with oil and without yeast. Crumble it and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. If your grain offering is cooked in a pan, it is to be made of the finest flour and some olive oil. Bring the grain offering made of these things to the Lord. Present it to the priest, who shall take it to the altar. He should take out the memorial portion of the grain offering and burn it on the altar as a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the food offerings presented to the Lord. Every grain offering you bring to the Lord must be made without yeast, for you are not to burn any yeast or honey in a food offering presented to the Lord. You may bring them to the Lord as an offering of the first fruits, but they are not to be offered on the altar as a pleasing aroma. Season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. Add salt to all your offerings. If you bring a grain offering of first fruits to the Lord, or for crushed heads of new grain roasted in the fire, put oil and incense on it. It is a grain offering. The priest shall burn the memorial portion of the crushed grain and the oil, together with all the incense, as a food offering presented to the Lord.
Well, good morning. Do passage open, Leviticus 2. Thank you very much. So you might be here thinking, well, what was all that about? Maybe you haven't been to church in a while, and you've come back, and this is kind of one of your first few weeks back, and you're thinking, I come to church, here I am, and now I'm talking about some flour being put on an altar and then it being burnt and all that kind of thing. You might think, that's a bit weird. Or maybe you were here 2 weeks ago and you're like, it's this again. Yes, we had this last time. Someone put some things on an altar and then it burnt and it went up and there was smoke and there was mingling and stuff. Yes, I remember that. But then you think, hang on, what's different this time? What are we gonna learn that's different this time from what came before? Or maybe you're a bit like me and you've heard the passage and you're like, oh, hang on. What's that all about? No yeast. No yeast? Oh, I wonder what that's for. No honey. That's a bit random, isn't it? Lots of incense. Or maybe, hang on, why are we even using grain in the first place? Why are we using flour? Well, this morning I think we're going to find that Leviticus 2 was a really vital part of the Old Testament kind of life for the people of Israel. And therefore also for us, it's going to be really helpful as we see what life as a Christian is like as we are devoted to the Lord and how we should be devoted to the Lord. So the book of Leviticus is a bit like God calling the people of Israel back to himself. Remember at the end of Exodus, you've got this issue where they've made this tabernacle and it's glorious, the glory of the Lord falls on the tabernacle, but the problem is they can't get in, can they? They can't get in. And the first words of Leviticus are very, very important. Verse 1 of chapter 1, the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. He said, speak. A lot of verbs about calling, speaking there, aren't there? This is God calling home the people of God. The very title of the sermon series is Come Home to God. This is Leviticus. This is what Leviticus is all about. God calling his people home. And so, at the beginning of Leviticus, we have this order of offerings, don't we? So first, last time we had the burnt offering, then we've got the grain, and then there's other ones coming after that. And it's a bit like, you've got to do things in the right order. Say, for example, you were someone who works in Buckingham Palace. Maybe you're one of those guys with the red coats and the big black hats. I forgot what they're called. But maybe you're one of those guys. When you turn up to work at Buckingham Palace, you don't just stick on your trackies, do you, and get down there. You've got to put your clothes on, and you've got to put them on in the right order, haven't you? You can't just put them on in any old order. Otherwise, it just wouldn't look good. So that's kind of like what's going on here. Leviticus is saying there's a clear order in which you've got to come into God for the Old Testament people of God. And so it's really important this grain offering comes after the burnt offering. Okay, because the burnt offering, remember, is about atonement being made. It's about the fact that now this person that has come and offered this burnt offering, their offering has gone up and is now at one with God. And so the question is, what are they going to do next? What are they going to do next now atonement has been made? Well, today we're going to go through this passage. It's going to be really quite simple. We're just going to go through it. Then we're going to see how it speaks about Jesus. Then we're going to see how it speaks about us. And as with 2 weeks ago, you might kind of spot the Jesus links as we go through. And, well, as you came to this passage, maybe you thought, feels like a bit of a come down compared to the week before. Last week, there was like the bull, or like at least an animal, a big animal of some sort. And this week, here we come with a bit of grain. You're like, a bit of grain? Why is that? What's all that about? Well, the first thing we need to notice is the fact that it is the best grain. Not just any grain, this is the best grain. Have a look at verse 1. When anyone brings a grain offering to the Lord, their offering is to be of the finest flour. They are to pour olive oil on it and put incense on it. Okay, so this isn't just any old grain, it is the finest flour. And then they don't just do anything with it, they pour olive oil on it and incense, showing this is a very significant, this is the best stuff we have. And then this again is emphasized in verse 2. Take it to Aaron's sons, the priests. So take a handful of the flour, that's again the same word as finest flour. So a handful of the finest flour and oil together with all the incense and burn it. And burn this as a memorial portion on the altar. A food offering, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So these words again are emphasized, aren't they? We hear finest flour again, we hear oil, we hear incense. This is not just someone at home thinking, what am I going to do? I'll just get what I've got in the cupboards from as if they're going to make a meal. They're not just getting, the tins out of the cupboards. It's like they're going to a Michelin star restaurant. This is the best of the best. And then this is what happens again in verses 4 to 10. Basically, the structure of this passage is you've got verses 1 to 3 if you're bringing just flour as it is. Verses 4 to 10 is what to do if you've got flour that's already been baked in something. And then 11 and onwards is kind of extra instructions. So this is the best flour. But what is the best flour for? I guess that's the big question, is it? What is the best flour for? And I think there's 3 big things this best flour is for. And the first is to honour the Lord. To honour the Lord. In verse 1, when it says, bring a grain offering to the Lord, the word really there is kind of just like gift offering, or like offering, or like tribute offering. So this is like someone bringing a tribute to the Lord, in honour of the Lord. Because think about what a tribute means to you. Maybe you can think of a tribute band. Tribute bands, often they're a bit naff, aren't they? But they're supposed to be in honour of the kind of original band, yeah? Or maybe after someone dies and someone speaks the news, say something like, tributes are being poured in, okay? Because this is in honour of the person who's died. So this is a tribute in honour of the Lord. Because the person giving this is recognising that all good things come from God. And so what do? They give back to God all the things they have of God. And this follows the burnt offering again, doesn't it? So they've now come, as it were, into the presence of God. They are now mingling, as it were, with him in the smoke. And now they are bringing the best of what they have as a tribute to honour the Lord. The second thing I think we see is if we look in verse 3. The rest of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the food offering presented to the Lord. And again in verse 10, the rest of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons, most holy parts of the food offering presented to the Lord. So this offering, in some ways, is to support the high priests in their ministry. Because this is, in fact, the only offering of which at least in the first 7 chapters of Leviticus, the only offering of which the priests take some of the offering for themselves. So through bringing this grain offering to the tabernacle, a Israelite is going and giving to the high priest to support them in their ministry. And I think from the perspective of the high priest, just think about how privileged they would feel to have that. Here is someone bringing something to the Lord, and I get to have some of that myself so I can continue to minister for him. And also, from the offerer's perspective, they are coming and thinking, wow, here I am, helping the Lord's tabernacle to keep going through providing this high priest with this offering. Those are the first 2 things. The third one's going to take a bit more time. And I think we're going to think about this as we think about some of those questions I mentioned at the beginning. Why grain? Why are we using grain in the first place? Or kind of all the regulations you get in verses 11 onwards. Why don't I just read those verses? So from verse 11, every grain offering you bring to the Lord must be made without yeast. For you are not to burn any yeast or honey in a food offering presented to the Lord. You may bring them to the Lord as an offering of the first fruits, but they are not to be offered on the altar as a pleasing aroma. Season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. Add salt to all your offerings. So what's all that about? What's the fact that you can't use yeast, or the kind of first fruits thing, or the salt? What's that got to do with it? Well, I think we might get an answer as we consider how the offering is referred to in verse 2 again, where it's called a memorial portion. This is a memorial portion. The high priest takes the grain, and then he says, this is a memorial portion. Memorial, that comes from the word to remember. So the question is, what is the offerer remembering as they bring this offering to the Lord? Well, grain, no yeast, salt, I think it's all linked with the covenant. I think it is. This is about declaring the covenant of God. See, grain, for example, if someone was to think about grain, they think, well, where am I going to get my grain from? I'm going to get my grain from the land. Then they're thinking, where am I going to get this land from? Because where are they at the moment? They're actually by the foot of Sinai still. They're basically in the desert, and so they're being told, go and get some grain and offer it to the Lord. Where are they going to get the grain from? Well, they're going to think, well, hang on. God promised that we would have a land. So in Genesis 17, God says this, I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. So this is what will be going through the mind of an Israelite as they hear the fact, I need to offer grain. Grain, it's got to come from land, hasn't it? The land I am promised is the land in which God made a covenant about. So that's the grain. Secondly, they're told they can't use yeast. Okay? And when they hear they can't use yeast, what are they going to think? First thing is Exodus, right? It's like no yeast, Exodus. It just comes straight in their brain. Like if I said to you, Batman and Robin, yeah? Fish and chips. Ant and deck. Mario and Luigi. That's right, yeah. Mario and Luigi. It's like no yeast, Exodus. It's just that clear for them. And Exodus is really God bringing his covenant into action and establishing it with Moses. We hear in Exodus chapter 6, God is here speaking to Moses at the burning bush, about to rescue his people. And he says this, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, that's the land again, where they resided as foreigners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving. I have remembered my covenant. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. The covenant is so clearly established with the fact that they were brought out of Egypt to freedom with God. So as they hear no yeast, don't put the yeast in the grain offering. They'll be thinking, yes, because this is God's promise to us, that he has saved us, and that is the basis of our covenant with God. And then salt. That came up again, didn't it, in our passage in Leviticus 2. And the salt, I think, just think for a moment, what does salt mean to you? Like, what would you use salt for? You'd put it in your food and stuff like that, wouldn't you? But what happens if you put like a bit too much salt in a meal? Ooh. Yeah, you really feel it, don't you? It's a very distinctive taste. And I think this is almost reminding the Israelites that as I offer this offering, I've got to put salt in, because salt is distinctive, so I should be distinctive. You shall be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. That's what God says to the people of Israel. And so the promise in Leviticus is that, as you offer this grain offering, you are being holy, you are being distinct from all the surrounding nations. Second thing that salt's good for, it's good for preserving stuff, isn't it? Back in the olden days, you didn't stick stuff in your fridge because you'd put it in the salt cellar. I mean, we're talking a long time ago, but you put stuff in your salt cellar because it would preserve the meat. And so here also, the salt of the covenant, I think, is supposed to make them think, I can trust this. This is a lasting promise of God. A covenant that is not going to run out on me. I can trust God. So picture, if you would, with me, the Israelites as they come with their offering. They come into the tent of meeting and they bring with them this grain offering. Through their mind, they're going to be thinking, I'm giving this as a gift to God, in tribute to him, in honour of him. They're going to be thinking, wow, as I do this, I get to support the priests over there. This tabernacle can keep going. Isn't that amazing? And then thirdly, they'll be thinking, I am putting my, as it were, my money where my mouth is. I am pledging myself to God. I am declaring that I am in the covenant community of God. I am in Israel. But then think with me, what are they bringing there? Grain. They come to God saying all those things and they bring grain? Surely they'd be thinking, I should come with so much more, shouldn't I? And obviously the other offerings do have other things in them. They're not just bringing grain. They've had the burnt offering, there's other offerings to come. But as they bring this grain, they'll be thinking, Lord, you deserve so much more, right? Well, the amazing news for us is, of course, when we come to God, we don't just come with grain. We come with someone far, far better. We come with the Lord Jesus. Because all of Jesus' life was a tribute to God. It was an offering, a glorious gift to God of his life. And we hear in Hebrews chapter 5, these words. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. Jesus' life on earth is an offering up of prayers and petitions. All of his life was done in service of God, wasn't it? Right from his birth. You can think about the time when he's 12 years old and he goes to the temple. All of his life is he's driving out demons in service of the Lord. As he preaches the good news, it's in service of the Lord. As he heals people, that's in service of the Lord. Ultimately, as he goes to his death, that is also in service of God, as an honouring to God. And that, of course, is what makes him a high priest. So his life is in honour to the Lord. And then he doesn't just support the high priest, does he? He becomes the high priest through his life and then through his death, resurrection, and ascension. And as he does that, he doesn't just declare the covenant. He establishes a better covenant. A covenant that will truly last. We read on in Hebrews, and once being made perfect, he became the source of eternal life for all who obey him. And then onwards into a different chapter, in chapter 8. But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. For if there be nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. So Jesus brings something better. As he honours the Lord with all of his life, brings a perfect tribute to the God, as he becomes our perfect high priest, he is able to establish this covenant, which is far, far better, isn't it? Think about the grain that as they brought that, they were thinking about the land. We can look forward to something far, far better. A whole new heavens and earth, made for God's glory. When they saw the no yeast, they were thinking Exodus, rescue from slavery. We get to think, I'm rescued from slavery to sin. My life that I was once controlled by sin I'm now free of that. I can now come to God. Whereas that was never the case before, was it? They had to go through all these offerings to come to God. Now we can do that straight away. And the salt of the covenant. This covenant is something that will last forever. We will be living with God in glory in the new creation forever. So remember our offerer as they come with their grain offering to the tent of meeting. They come with their grain. We come with something far, far better. Someone far, far better. Through whom we can approach God as our Father. And now, because of him, all of our lives can be in devotion to him. Because now we can follow Christ's example of his tribute, of his life. We can also do that. And while they bring grain, we get to bring Jesus. And as we come to God with Jesus, as we live our lives in tribute, in honour to him, he uses what we do. He is the high priest who uses what we have in support of his ministry. I think, for example, of one of Aaron's friends. He was relatively new to uni at the time. He decided, I'm just going to be a Christian. I'm going to go to church, that kind of thing. One of the things he thought I'm going to do is I'm going to help my friend with their chemistry homework because they were really struggling. And so they helped this person with their chemistry homework. And as they were doing that, they chatted. And that person then, sorry, did it again. Sorry, it's Aaron, that's why I'm crying. Woo! Anyway, that person then spoke to Matt more, and Matt was like, this is what the gospel's all about. And they got good friends, and then he brought Aaron to church, and from there, became a Christian. So the small things we do in this life, little things which can seem quite small, can actually be used by our high priest for amazing things, for his ministry. When we bring our lives as offerings to God, he takes them and he uses that for the growth of his kingdom. And that's glorious. And in terms of declaring the covenant, well, when we come to God, we don't come and say, I'm going to bring myself into that. God, Christ 100% brings us in by bringing us into Christ, by giving us regeneration. There is nothing for us to do to become friends with God. He does it for us. And then the whole of our lives should show that. But there are particular ways in which God has given us that we should declare the fact that we are part of the covenant. Just as they had specific ways of declaring their participation in the covenant, so do we. For example, last week, wasn't it wonderful to be at Timothy's baptism, for those of us who were here? And as Timothy did that was like his declaration of, I am in God's covenant, I am in God's new covenant with him. It was almost like he was bringing his tribute to God. And that's as we begin our lives as Christians. But there's more than that, isn't there? Every week, well, not every week, but many weeks, we would celebrate the Lord's Supper. As we come to church and we partake in the Lord's Supper, what we're doing there is we are doing this kind of tribute offering, but in a better way, aren't we? We are longing for a land that is not just a land of Canaan, but the new creation. And we picture that as well, as it is a meal. As we eat that meal, it is like a microcosm, a picture of that greater meal that will come as we feast with the Lord in the new creation, in the heavenly banquet. And as we think about, as we take the Lord's Supper, we also remember what has happened to us. The fact that we have been saved. And then we kind of own that. We say, yes, I was a sinner, but because of your blood, because of your body, I have now been saved through your death. And it is also a way in which we show ourselves to be distinct. Remember the salt of the covenant thing? That was a way of showing the fact that Israel are distinct from the surrounding nations. One of the ways in which the Lord's Supper works is it kind of sets apart, it shows who the people of God are. So let me encourage you, actually, if you're here this morning, and you then go on later this morning to take the Lord's Supper, you are very much doing the declaring of the covenant. You are honouring the Lord as you do that. But let me also encourage you that as we do this, we shouldn't just kind of remember in a passive sense, oh yeah, Jesus died to take away my sins. Declaring isn't just kind of recalling as if to remember. It's so much more. It's to own the very thing that we are calling to our mind. So when you take the Lord's Supper, you should be owning the fact that you were a sinner, but now because of Exodus, as it were, because of being saved from sin, I am now in with God. And then also when we do it, we should also be thinking, as I take this is kind of like a foretaste, a picture of the glorious meal that will come as I enter new creation with the Lord. And also it should be done in thanks to Jesus, because Jesus gave his life as a tribute to God for us, and through that he established a better covenant. So let me pray.